All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to this webinar, everyone, of Going Beyond the Timeline, Building an Interactive Game Inside of Storyline. My name is Jeff Batt with eLearning Brothers, and I'm the Product Development Manager, and I'll be walking you through this webinar. Now, just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the question and answer area. And I won't be looking at that the entire time, but every once in a while I will go back and I will take a look at those questions just to make sure all the questions are answered. So anytime you have a question, just feel free to type it in there, and we can go ahead and start from there. Now, I haven't shown my screen yet. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen here. All right. So this webinar is how to go beyond using the normal timeline of side of Storyline, how to really take advantage of the interactive parts that you can do inside of Storyline. That's using triggers, that's using variables, that's using other elements, visual elements, establishing some type of game board or progress meter or something like that. And so those are types of things that you can do to really go beyond just using the storyline, the animation, timeline, and use the interactivity a little bit more. So that's the point of this session, and we're going to be going over. We won't. Obviously, we only have an hour, so I can't cover every single thing inside of creating these types of games, but I am going to give you a lot of information that you can start from there and to start building your own types of games, your own types of interactions as well. So now before I do, I do have a couple questions for the audience, and so I want to get to know what you guys are, where you guys are at right now, and so if I can kind of lead my session a little bit different, I'm more than happy to as well. So I'm going to launch a poll. And first of all, going to ask, what type of Storyline user are you? Obviously, this is a session about Storyline, so I just want to see what type of user for Storyline you are. So are you a Storyline ninja, semi-pro, minor league, newbie, or don't even know what Storyline is? Okay, so looks like most of you are kind of in the minor league. You've been using Storyline a little bit. I take that as you've used some triggers, you've used some variables, but haven't used it as much. Semi-pro, maybe you've used a little bit more triggers, maybe you've used some more variables inside of there. And newbies, you're just starting out with Storyline, you've used it a little bit, or you haven't used it at all. So in this one, we are not going to be talking about all the basics inside of Storyline, but I will cover heavily triggers, and I will cover heavily variables and establishing or using those when you're building these types of games. So if you're already familiar with variables, you're already familiar with triggers, then this might be a little bit basic for you, so just keep that in mind. But for now, it looks like most of you will be fine. We're going to be starting out with using more of this type of triggers and variables in there. So, okay, I also want to know what type of roles you are in your company. Are you a graphic designer, instructional designer, e-learning developer, or a web developer? You're just getting into the e-learning realm or anything like that. So go ahead and answer that. Okay. Looks like most of you are e-learning developers, so that's a good sign that you're actually already building e-learning courses, and so this will be perfect for you. And then one last thing just to get to know, are you currently an eLearning Brothers subscriber? Do you have the library subscription? Are you a free user, interaction builder, or free interaction builder, or currently don't have any eLearning Brother products? So go ahead and answer that. All right. So it looks like we're directly split down the middle. So half of you are library subscriptions users and half of you are not. So, all right. So that gives me some good information, and we can go ahead and get started with the presentation here. We have a lot to cover, so I'm just going to dive right into it. You can find our library subscription. You can sign up for a free subscription and get access to some of our templates, storyline templates, people cutouts, interactions, Adobe Edge templates, and you can get that at elearningtemplates.com. And if you do want to be a subscriber, it is $2.99 a year, and you get access to all of our templates, storyline templates, Edge templates, HTML5 templates, Flash templates, people pictures, graphics, everything like that. You get access, full access to it for only $2.99 a year. So if you want to find out more information, go to elearningtemplates.com. Just a little plug-in for that. Okay, so what we're talking about is really taking, when you're talking about e-learning, you're basically taking interactive content, quizzes, or anything like that. And when you want to make those things more interactive or more visually appealing, that's what we're going to be talking about. You usually want to try to apply those to a game. Take the questions and not just have a regular multiple choice question. Have different questions with learner objectives where they have to accomplish a certain goal, or they have to go through a different map or progress or anything like that. Those are the different elements that you can really apply into Storyline. And you can use that inside of Storyline to help the learner accomplish some type of goal, which would help them in learning as well. Now, I basically worked with a company that established some games within their training. Typically, or before they used these games, they were just using normal quizzes, multiple choice quizzes, true or false quizzes, and then they decided to add a little bit more interactive games, like something like this, like you see here, like a game show game or something like that. Now, as soon as they added those games in, they saw a dramatic increase in the scores of their quiz. Now, they didn't use these as quizzes, they used these as just interactions inside of their games, and then still had the quizzes at the end of the course. But because of the games, the learner was able to go back and they were practicing, they were trying to get a better score, and it really helped them improve their score inside of Storyline. So the types of things that you can do, besides just going on or just using the multiple choice questions as a game, you can add different types of progress meters or maps or different types of goals or objectives. For example, like the game show, you have different categories to choose from, and depending on the category, if you choose the correct answer, you get a certain amount of points, and the goal is to get as many points as possible. There's other types of games where you're progressing through a map, and you have different points that you're jumping to, depending if you've answered the question correct or incorrect. You also have different point values or progress elements like this. How many points can you get throughout with as many questions as you're answering and stuff like that. So these are all things to keep in mind that you can add on to your different types of questions in order to continue or to really enhance your different interactions to make them more like games. So a couple visual tips to keep in mind is you first of all can establish a nice background. Now there's some elements that you can do inside of the background that I think are small, but they add a lot more visual appeal than just having a white background or something like that. And I just want to show you a quick tip on that. If you go into Storyline, and I'm going to go ahead and start a new project here. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to type those in. But if you go into Storyline, let's just go ahead and go into one of these slides here. If you go to View and then come up to Slide Master, this allows you to establish a background for all of your elements of your pages. So if you wanted to establish a good, nice gradient background, you can select this drop-down box of background styles, come down to Format Background, and then select Gradients. Now you'll notice over on the left-hand side we have a gradient now, but I can select different types of gradients. Right now it's a linear gradient, but I can select the drop-down box to go to radial gradients, and I get a nice radial gradient. It looks a little bit better, and then I can establish the direction of the gradient as well. Now, when you're working with gradients inside of Storyline, you have a couple different gradient stops that you can work with. So in this case, we have two stops, stop 1 and stop 2. Well, the stop 1, you can adjust the start position or the position of this stop, and I don't like how this white is kind of pushed up to the blue here. So I'm going to go ahead and just drag this down, and you'll notice now we have a nice consistent, we don't have a hard stop like we did before, we have a nice consistent stop there as well. Now I can select the drop down box to be something different. Let's just go for like a light gray, and then I can come up to stop 2. If I go to stop 2, now I can select the drop down box to have this be a little bit more darker gray, and go ahead and hit close. So some simple changes, but this adds a lot to my storyline background basically. And if I'm doing a game, one thing that I found the difference between a bad game and a good game is the kind of the visuals, the background. So that's the very first thing you want to do. Now you can find different patterns to go into the background. If you are a subscriber to eLearning Brothers, you can go over to stock images in the template library, which is at elearningtemplates.com. If you hover over stock images, come down to backgrounds. We have a lot of different pattern backgrounds that you can choose from. So for example, if I want to scroll down here and get this nice circle background here, I can just grab that. Download the 720 by 540 because that's the dimensions of my storyline right now. Go ahead and download that. And now I can import this into my master slide. I'm still within my master slide here. So I go ahead and click on Insert, Picture, and then find my master slide or find that image here. And there we go. So I have a nice image laid out there. And now I can close my master slide, and now any slide, if I go to new slide, any slide that I create will have that background. So I can get a universal theme, so my game has a theme as well as my other interactions have the same type of theme as well. So those are just some things with the background. That's one thing to keep in mind when you're establishing a game is to get that visual, nice background, deep colors, different patterns, backgrounds like that. Now, another visual tip, and then we'll get into the programming part of it, is buttons. To really enhance your buttons, make them look nice. You can also do this by gradients as well. So if you come into Storyline, let's click on Inserts. If you click to insert a button, one thing that always bugged me with Storyline is if I try to insert a button and I wanted to get rid of these rounded corners, there really wasn't a way if I'm just using normal buttons. Now, one trick that I found is if you have this button, if I insert a shape, just a regular rectangle shape, I can actually format this button by selecting this object, come over to Home, select on Format Painter with this object selected. Now, Format Painter is really nice because now I can apply this format of whatever object I've selected to any other object, so not including the shape or size or width or height or anything like that. But if I select this rectangle, now it looks exactly like the button and it functions exactly like a button as well, but I get these hard, sharp corners instead of these rounded corners. Because again, on the button, if you just do a normal button, you only get this really rounded corner or just the rounded corner option for the rectangle. So that's a way to just get a rectangle, a button with the sharp corners if you wanted to do that. But if you wanted to change the gradient of the button, you just basically select that button, come up to Format, and you can select on this little drop down box under Shape Styles. This will expand out to your options here. And then you can come to Fill. And you'll notice that this fill, even though it's a solid color, it's still a type of gradient, basically. And anytime you change it to a different color, you still kind of get a gradient there. Well, if you wanted to have more control over that gradient, you select the gradient fill, and you can select what type of gradients. If you want a radial gradients inside of the button, a linear gradients, the angle that you want the gradient at as well, and then you have your different stops as well. Now there's 3 different stops here, but really I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of one of them. So now I only have 2 stops, and I can establish just 2 different colors to make a nice looking button. So if I come up to stop 1, let's just go ahead and have a light blue. And then if I come down to stop 2, I'll go ahead and just establish a dark blue. Well, if I wanted to get that reflection type of look, well, all I have to do is basically change my stop position to 50. If I change that to 50 on stop 1, come over to stop 2 and do the same thing here, you'll notice maybe that's a little bit light of a color. If I go a little bit darker here, there you go. I get this nice reflection, this nice shiny look on my button, and then I can just go type in my my text here for the continue, whatever I want. So you get a really nice visual update for your button, so you can establish some nice looking items for your game as well. So those are the 2 types of visual elements that I wanted to talk about, backgrounds and buttons. And now we're going to get into game setup, the different types of the things that you can do when you're actually setting up a game or an interaction inside of Storyline. So if you're going to be building these types of more interactive stuff in Storyline, this is my recommendations of how to build that. Now, one thing when I was looking through and I was first building these different types of games inside a Storyline, one thing that I was questioning about, what was the best way of building these types of games? Do I have, I'm going to have a game with 20 questions. And in this game of 20 questions, do I go to different pages for each question? So question 1 will be on one page, question 2 will be on a different page. Well, one thing I found about Storyline that I really liked about Storyline is you don't have to go through those different pages. So I don't have to have 20 different pages for all 20 questions. I can have all 20 questions within my one page basically and still make it easier to update inside of that. And you use that, or you do that by using slide layers. So you have your initial introduction game inside, or your introduction in the game itself, and then you can go to different parts of your layers for question 1, and then incorrect, and then question 2, correct, question 3, and then finally to the conclusion. Now the nice thing about that is on different layers you can affect what is happening on different layers as well. And so now you're not worried about, okay, did I accidentally lose a page? Did I delete that page? Where did this page go? Trying to look at everything, what's going to what. You have everything contained within inside of one slide, and everything contained within these layers, which makes it a little bit easier when you're going up and you're editing the questions. You can start at question 1, go to question 1 correct, question 2 correct, and just move on from there. Basically, start from the bottom and move to the top. So that's one recommendation that I have, is to really work with these layers, to not just use the base layer inside of Storyline, or not just link to different pages, but if you're going to create one interaction or one game, really use those layers within Storyline. And I'll show you that once we actually get into the content. Now, some of the other game setup stuff that you can do is really establish a good looking intro page. And so we have the logo of the game. In this case, this is a game that's up and coming to our library. Should be out within the next couple weeks inside of Storyline. But basically we wanted to establish a logo and then a big play button. And this play button will take you to the instructions. And so then you have an instructions page that gives you some more information to the user, or gives more information to the user on how to use this game. And then they can just continue from there. So these are important steps to keep in mind when you're establishing some type of interaction or some type of game, is you want to let the user know how to use this game or what to keep in mind as they go throughout that game. Now then it comes the next part where you have some type of game board or map. You're giving the user something to do. So in this case, this is a game very similar to Deal or No Deal. So we have a game board with 26 cases. Now in these cases, the user basically will choose their case, and then they can go on, and every case that they choose from there, they answer a question, they get the points, and then they get offered an offer from the banker as they go throughout these different types of questions. So if you establish any type of game board like the game show, or if you establish anything that the learner is going to accomplish, and you allow the user to choose which question they want to go to, it provides a little bit more of a game element rather than just a sequence questions, one question after the other, basically. And then as you go through, because these are learning objectives, you want to answer you want to ask your questions. So whether it be true or false questions, multiple choice, or hotspot questions or anything like that, you can do that once you get to this question. And this is a different layer inside of Storyline. So you navigate to this question, and then depending on the choices that they make, you'll start adding points to the score, or you'll take away points from the score, or you'll send them to the correct feedback, or you'll send them to the incorrect feedback. And so these are things to keep in mind, that, okay, once I get to the questions, this is what needs to happen on the questions layer. And that's where the feedback comes in. Okay, depending on the choice that they made, send them to the correct feedback layer or send them to the incorrect feedback layer. And now we'll get into how to do this in a second, but this is just kind of the setup that I wanted to follow. So after they've answered their question, then you send them back to the game board, and now they can choose a different option. They can see how many points they've gained in that in that question, or how many points they lost or something like that. So you're establishing these game elements. And I found that users, they really like this because they're trying to get a goal. They're trying to get more points, and they'll keep playing the game over and over until they get more points, and it helps them learn as they go throughout these questions. And then the last element that you want is the conclusion page. After they've completed the different questions, the game is over. You want to tell them how they did. You want to show them their score, give them any final feedback that you want, and then maybe give them the option to play again, to start over. So those are the different elements that we're going to be talking about inside of this session. So now, some important things to keep in mind to be able to do this. We can establish the graphics, kind of like we talked about, establish some nice looking buttons to lay that out, have a nice background and everything inside of Storyline. Then you want to start establishing something called variables. Now, variables are basically stored information that allow you to control where the user goes depending on what they've actually selected. Now, there's 3 different types of variables inside of Storyline. Now, those variables are text, number, and Boolean. Now, we'll go over what each of those are. So the Boolean is basically a true or false state. So you can have a variable that's basically true or false. So in this case, you'll notice where it says Boolean variable under the name section, that pretty much can be whatever name you want. You can establish whatever variable name that you want to come up with to help you remember. You will be using that throughout your game, so just keep that in mind. And then you establish what type it is, true or false, which is the Boolean, text or number, basically. And then you establish the value. What is the default value for this? And so if I want like true or false, be off and on. If it's something is right, something is incorrect, then you want to use something like a Boolean. Now this is mainly used for like settings, questions, or answer questions, correct and incorrect, or visited items. So if you visit a timeline, for example, a point in the timeline, and you don't want the user to come back, then you would use something like a true or false variable. So the true or false variable basically means that if you click on that object, you can change that variable to true now, and that means the user can't click on that anymore if it's true. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then there's number variables. So number variables can be used for scores. So if you're going to have a score throughout your game, you would establish a number variable, a score variable, or percentages, or page or question counters. So if you're going to count the number of questions, you can establish a variable for question counters and then just update that variable every time someone goes through a new question, and that will just update the question counter. And then there's also text variables, which pretty much could be whatever value you want. So if you wanted to establish your own value, you can do that for like correct words. If you're going to do like check a fill in the blank question or anything like that, you can establish a text variable. And then, so once you have these variables, the important thing to do inside of the game is to establish triggers. What happens when they click on it? So they have a multiple choice question. What will happen if they choose option A, or if they choose option B, or if they choose option C? And the different types of triggers that I found that you use inside of games usually consist of changing the state. So if you wanted to change a visited item to look different, you can change the state of an object using this trigger. You can also show a layer. So if you wanted to go from one layer to another layer, and we'll get into this here in a second, so if this is going over your head, I apologize, but just to give you an overview, we'll get into this and start working with these a little bit more. But you can show the layer, you can show a little pop-up message for anything like instructions or help info. If you wanted to give the learner help and pop it up over the content, you can do that with a light box. You can play media, sounds. You want to give the learner immediate feedback when they get something correct, and usually you can do that by a sound, like applause or anything like that, or if they get something incorrect, you can play a different type of sound as well. Adjusting the variable. So this means that if you have a variable that's true or false, then you want to, and the learner clicks on that button, you now want that to be a different option. So you want it to be a true, then you can change that as well. or adjusting the variable also means adding points to the overall score. So if they have a game show game and they select the 200 category, then you want to add, if they get it right, you want to add 200 points to that variable. So that's another trigger that you'll be using inside of Storyline, is the adjust variable. And then the last thing that you may want to do is execute JavaScript. Now, if you're not a JavaScript person, that is fine, but something that could be useful for this is if you're creating a custom game, there's no way by default to have that track inside of an LMS. So there's some custom JavaScript that you can just copy from us, and I'll give that to you in a little bit, that you can just copy that and then use it to send the score of your custom game over to the LMS. Okay, so let me just make sure there aren't any questions, but then we'll get into the content and I'll show you how to do some of these interactions. One question is, maybe you'll cover this later, is there a way to reset all variables to their default setting at some point during the activity? That's a great question, Fletcher. There is a way to do that. You basically, the play again button that we have at the end of our games, we're basically just resetting all of the variables and hiding that layer so it takes them back to the base layer. And you do have to do it by one. If the score is like 100, then you have to reset it back to 0 or something like that. So great question. Hopefully that helps. Okay, so I'm going to close out this little sample here, and I'm going to go into the interactive part. We're first of all going to be talking about an interaction, and then we'll get into more of a game with different types of questions. Now, this interaction is a timeline interaction that will be out in our library here soon in a couple weeks as well. And we have different timeline elements. We have a little progress bar down at the bottom. We have different circles that the learner will be able to click on. And we have different introductions. We have a begin button, a next button, and a back button. So the object is to give the learner some instructions, and then after that to allow the user to navigate on their own by clicking in the timeline or by clicking next and navigating through the different points inside of the timeline. Now, a couple things we established is on the timeline, if I select this, let me just bring up my timeline here. If on this timeline where it has orange, green, and blue, if I want there to be different sections, I can establish different graphics within those sections. And you can do that in the states. So if I come into the states tab, you'll notice that I have a normal state, which is just one big solid color. I have a second bar state, which is basically two colors. I have a third bar, I have a fourth bar, and up to fifth bar. So every time I use this interaction, I basically can choose which bar I want to use. Now you can do that without any type of triggers or anything like that. If you've established them all inside of different states, which you can click on Edit States, click on this little New State button, and you can establish your own state, click on Add, and then once you've clicked on Add, you can select the graphic, come up to Format, and then click on Change Picture if you wanted to go find a different picture for a different state. Basically, you can establish that. Or if you wanted to change what the initial state of this was, you can select this drop down box and say, okay, I want to work with 5 bars. So if I select 5 bars now the initial state will be 5 bars that I can work with. But let me switch it back to 3 bars, and that's just a way without programming to establish what that is. But I can establish that in a variable as well. If I wanted to just quickly update a variable, I can also adjust the state of that object based on a variable. And I do that inside of Storyline by coming over to the trigger section. You'll be working with the trigger section a lot if you're building these types of interactions, so keep this in mind. If I come over to the right hand side, there's this little X button. And this basically, if I hover over it, says Manage Project Variables. This is where I work with all of my variables inside of Storyline. And this is what really makes Storyline a powerful tool. You can basically establish these different types of variables and then do things depending on the variables. So now this is project level. It doesn't have to do with this specific page. These variables have to do with the entire project. So if I click on that variable object, I can come over to the variables little pop-up here. And I can add new variables by clicking on this little page icon here, this page button. And if I click on that, it'll pop open with my new variable input box here. And then I can go ahead and just establish my variable. So let's say I want a variable to adjust the bar to the different states depending on this variable. So I'm going to name my variable something specific so I know that this has to do with the bar. So I'm just going to name it num of bars. And it's easier if you capitalize every single word that you're using, but you can't use any spaces. So keep that in mind. I'm hitting the space bar right now, but nothing's happening. So that's basically a standard when you're working with variables, is to have it all one word, but capitalize the first letter in all of your words that you use, but just something that you can recognize that with. So, okay, so since this is going to hold the number of bars that I'm going to be working with, it's a number, so it's just you kind of have to logically think through that a little bit. So if this, it's going to be a number of 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1. So that's the type of variable. I'm going to select the drop-down box to be a number. And the default value, let's go ahead and just say the default value is 3. By default, I want there to be a 3 in this variable. Now, that's all I have to do. I've established that variable. It's in there. Now it's ready for me to use. You'll notice the use count right now is set to 0 because I haven't used it. It's just there. I need to use it inside of my project. And you don't do that within the variable section. You actually do that within the trigger section. Now, since I'm on this page, now I can establish a trigger to change this picture here automatically based on that variable. So if I come into the trigger, I can click on create a new trigger, which is this same plus icon or page icon. If I select that, now it pops open with my trigger wizard. Now keep in mind, this is the same type of logic you would use if you're familiar at all with ActionScript, JavaScript, any type of coding language. So keep in mind that even though this still takes a little bit of getting used to, it's a whole lot easier than working with, than coding it yourself. So just wanted to reassure you there if you're already starting to get overwhelmed. So just keep that in mind. So this is where you can establish the different types of triggers. So you can jump to a certain slide, you can jump to, you can adjust a variable, you can change the state of, and you can show a lightbox or do lots of different things here. Now we wanted to change this image to be different states depending on that variable. So we're going to go ahead and select the drop down box, come down to change state of, select what object we want to change, which I'm going to go ahead and select the bar, and you'll notice as I hover over it, a little red highlight shows up over the bar, and we want to change it to a state of 4, the fourth bar, when the timeline starts, if the number is 4. Well, right now there's no if statement right here, so I have to do that by clicking on show conditions. If I click on show conditions, I can come down to the plus, and this basically allows me to show or to add a condition that you're going to show this the state depending on the number. So we already have this listed out as variables here. I'm going to select the drop down box to if the number of bars is equal to the value of 4. I'm going to type in 4. Then it's going to show the fourth bar because we want the fourth bar showing if the number of bars is set to 4. So looks like it's all good right there. I can go ahead and click OK. And now if I come over here, come back to my variables and change the default value to 4, come over to preview this slide, you'll notice that even though it was showing 3 before I previewed it, now it's showing 4. Now that's a lot of work to do that, and then basically not when I could just go into the initial state and change that. So what's the benefit? The benefit is if you're basically establishing these as templates. So if you're creating courses, it's highly beneficial to you to do whatever you can to establish templates, because then you don't have to redo your work later down the road. So if you're building 5 different courses, and in these courses, you're basically going to be using some of the same types of interactions. Instead of rebuilding that same interactions, if you establish these types of templates, you can use those inside of Storyline or even hand them off to other people, and all they have to do is update a number to get to the right format that they want. So keep that in mind. That's how you would change the variable or change an object to a different state depending on a variable. One question that popped up is, would you need to create those condition statement triggers for each value? Um, yes, you would actually. You would need to copy this and paste it, and once you copy it, then it's just basically saying, okay, show the fifth bar if this number is 4, basically, or 5. And now if it's set to number 5, then it would change it to number 5. Okay, so I know that one probably was a little bit hard if you're just starting out, especially if you're a newbie, to kind of grasp that concept. So I apologize for that, but that is something that if you learn, or if you learn how to grasp that, you can do a lot of cool things. You can do a lot of interactive stuff inside of Storyline. Okay, now simple trigger, if I wanted to just go from this layer to the next layer, by selecting the begin button, I can come over to my trigger and just say, okay, I want to jump to, or I want to show a layer, and then select the drop down box of which layer. Now I'm just going to show a layer 1. If I did have a condition, depending on an object selected, I could say, okay, show layer 1 if this is true, show layer 1 if that's true. But in this case, I'm not worried about that. I'm just going to go ahead and show layer 1 just by selecting that. So now if I go ahead and preview this, there it is. I have my begin button. When I select my begin button, it shows layer 1. Now you'll notice that this timeline bar is actually still here, basically. Now on each of these layers, coming down to the bottom right hand side, we have different layers to choose from, different slide layers, basically. If I go up and I select these different layers, you'll know the content, you'll see that the content has actually changed. These objects allow me to insert, or these layers allow me to insert my own content inside of there. But I can also choose, pick and choose which layers or which objects from the base layer. Now the base layer is the very bottom layer. I can pick and choose when I'm on these layers what objects to show. So I don't have to recreate my timeline in every single layer. What I can do is basically just hide and show certain objects on the base layer that I want to keep there. So if I come down to, or if I stay on my timeline 1, move up my timeline a little bit, and I select where it says base layer objects, you can see that I'm hiding the introduction text so we don't have overlapping text. I'm hiding the introduction text as well, or the header and the regular text, and I'm hiding the begin button so we don't have the begin button showing on these layers as well. And really the only new objects that I'm adding to this layer are the content header and the content text itself. And that way when I come to layer 1, it's only going to show what I've selected on the base layer. And that way I don't have to have many different buttons for the different timelines. I only have one section on the base layer, and this button will always go to a certain timeline, or the other button will always go to a different timeline. And so that's what I'm doing, is I'm establishing that here. And I can do the same thing on the circles. If I want the learner to be able to jump to these timelines just by selecting the circle, then I can come and just select that object, come over to my trigger, and select show layer, and say, okay, timeline 1, if they select this, come to circle 2, select this and go timeline 2, select this and go, okay, if they select this object, go to timeline 3, and same thing with 4 and 5. Now, because I have these buttons on the base layer, if I preview this, those objects, and I'm not hiding them when I go to different layers, now basically it doesn't matter where I'm at, I can select those buttons and it will jump to that point in the timeline. So now it's at 3, back to 4, 2, come back to 5, and those are the different objects that I can, or the different timelines that I can adjust basically. All right, so that's a basic timeline layer that I can use the adjust variable, the number of bars to change a graphic, but that's basically it for this timeline. Is you basically select these different objects to go to different layers inside of there, and that's the start of an interaction. Now you would also want to adjust like the next button, and on the next button, if you're at a certain point, to go to a certain point in the timeline. So by selecting the object, I can create a trigger just to go to the next timeline, which would be in this case timeline 1. and that would go to timeline 1, and then I can have a next button on timeline 1 that would go to timeline 2, and different things like that. So there's a question that popped up. With this example, the project developer would be the only one to change the variable, correct? Because there isn't an input or previous trigger that changes the value of what the user would see. That's correct, unless you change the variable, or if you wanted the user to be able to change that variable, basically. So if you, let's go ahead and just create some different shapes. So I'm going to go ahead and create an object here. And now if I have this object, let's just give that object 4. Let's go ahead and give this object a number of 5, and we'll just do that for now. And if I wanted to add a trigger to this object, I can come over to the right-hand side and click on Create Trigger. And the trigger that I can do is I can select the drop-down box and go to Adjust Variable. Well, if I select Adjust Variable, I can select which variable I want to adjust, and I'm going to select number of bars here. And the number of bars, I'm going to set this equal to. You can add it here, or you can set it equal to. And I'm going to select this equal to the value of 4. And so now I'm giving the user the option to be able to change this if you wanted to do that. And so in this case, I'm going to go ahead and select OK. And now if I preview this, and I select the number 4, I also want to add a different variable. So if I have this rectangle, we're resetting the number of bars, but we also want to change. Right after that, we want to change the state of the bar, and I want to change it to number 4. When the user clicks, if the variable number of bars is equal to 4. So it's the same thing that we did with it before. We established, okay, change this bar to this if whatever number it is, basically change it to that state. So now if I go ahead and hit preview, you'll notice as soon as I select 4, it now changes to the 4 bar instead of just the 1 bar. Let me go ahead and redo that again. So by default, it's set to 3. If I adjust it to 4, or if I select 4, now that bar adjusts to 4. So you can do things like that. You can change different states depending on the variable. You can allow the user to change the variable, but you'd have to program that in. Otherwise, it would be just the developer that does that. Couldn't you reorder the triggers to move the first trigger down to under the button trigger? You could do that to be, this slide triggers actually show up above the button triggers, so just keep that in mind. If right now this is just basically based, as soon as the slide starts, change this depending on what the default variable is. All right, so that's one other thing you can do is depending on you can adjust the variables. If you wanted to show things, if something is true or false, you can do that as well. And you first of all establish the variables, and then you create your buttons to do stuff depending on that. So let's go ahead and get into the actual game. So I'm going to get into this the beginning of this game, and this is the Beat the Banker game that again is coming out in a couple of weeks. And I just have a couple different layers. I have the first layer, which basically just has a play button. And on that play button, all I want to do is add some audio triggers. And so I want to play a click button when they click on it. I want to play a hover button when they hover it. So I'm coming over to the triggers. I'm going to select this object, and I'm going to select the drop-down box, go down to Play Media, and I'm going to select the drop-down box to my audio that says click, and then I'm going to have it when the user clicks. So as soon as the user clicks this button, it's going to make that little clicking sound. And we have sounds found on the library as well. If you hover over library, or if you go to our library, go to sounds, you can download clicking, hovering noises as well. So there's different sounds that you can download if you don't have access to those already. Now on that play button, we also want to add a hover sound when the user hovers over that button. So I'm going to select this button, and I'm going to add a trigger to play the media, select the drop-down box to be hover, and then select OK. So there's two different play medias here, but I actually forgot to change when to hover, so I'm going to select the drop-down box to, so from user clicks to mouse hovered over. So as soon as the mouse is hovered over, it's going to click that or play that hover sound. Now, you won't be able to hear it if I preview it through GoToMeeting, so I'm not going to worry about that. But the next thing we want to do with a button, we have our sounds playing. The next thing we want to do is basically just go to the instructions page when they click on play. So simple instructions layer, show the layer. So I'm going to go ahead and select this trigger. I'm going to go select the drop-down box to show layer. And I'm working within one page right now. So we're working with a bunch of different layers, but within the course, the user's only going to be on this one page. And so they're not going to see them navigating through different pages. It's all going to be on this one page. So we're going to show the layer of the instructions. So I'm going to select the drop-down box, come down to instructions, and when the user clicks, it's going to go to this instructions page. Simple as that. If I preview this inside of Storyline, just to make sure it works, I like to preview it as I'm going to make sure everything is going good. There's my play, and then it takes me to my instructions. So my instructions, basically I do the same thing here. I can establish the sound. Now here's the nice thing is, if I imported my sound, you'll notice the sound over here. These three little audio icons, I've imported my click and my hover sound inside of Storyline already. Well, because I'm using that on one slide on the base layer, I can still access that on any other layer without having to re-import my sound. So your file size isn't growing basically, but you're still able to access that sound on these buttons. So if I select the start button, go to triggers, select the trigger here, then I can come in and select the drop-down box. Actually, let's do play media first of all, and we're going to do the click sound. So the click sound is still here. It's still accessing that from the base layer. And again, so I don't have to report my sound, and I don't have to have multiple sound files and increasing my file size basically. Okay, so the only other thing we need to do is go ahead and show the next layer, which show layer is, in this case, we're going to take them to the game board. And so the game menu, if I click OK, we're ready to go here. I'm going to go ahead and preview this again. So on my first page, click on play. My second page, click start game. And now it takes me to my game board. So we got a couple steps down in working with this game. So here's my game menu. Now if I select the layer on my game menu, now I can select these different objects, which are briefcases in this case. I can select these different objects and go to different questions depending on which object it is. So if I want the briefcase 1 to go to question 1, I can do that by selecting this object on the stage, coming over to create a trigger, and then selecting question 1. So I'm going to drop down to question 1. When the user clicks OK. Now, what if I want them, you'll notice here, let me go to question 1 and let me take them back to the game board for now. We'll come back to question 1, but I'm just going to take them back to the game board after they select this correct answer basically. So you'll notice a problem here. Actually, okay, so let me preview this. So if I hit start game, select question 1. If I select the correct answer, it takes me back to question 1. But I can select question 1 again and come back to it. So that's where a variable would come in handy. If you had a true or false variable saying that question 1 was answered, then you can prevent them from being able to go back to question 1. So if I come into my variable section and I establish a variable here, and I just say question 1 answered, and again you can name it whatever you want. I'm going to establish a true or false variable, and then I'm going to say this by default is going to be true, and then click OK. Now I'm going to come back into the game board, and I'm going to say I'm first of all going to adjust this to be true, and then so basically when they click on this, it's now going to be true. So I'm going to select this object, come down, select the drop-down box to be question 1, or actually to adjust variable. And I'm going to change the variable of question 1 answered. I'm going to change it to be equals to true. And if I select the value or variable, and I'm selecting the value to be true. And now when the user clicks on this, it's going to automatically change it to true. And I'm going to do that before we actually take them. I'm going to move, you can move the different triggers using these arrow buttons over on the right hand side. And so I'm going to do that before it takes them to the question. Now the reason why is because, actually no, I'm going to do that after, sorry about that. So the reason why is because I want to change it to true after we go to the question, means that it's been visited now. And I can even do this on question 1. I can change that variable to the true on question 1 if I wanted to. There's many different ways that you can do this. Now on this, now I'm going to come back into the show layer question 1 because we don't want to show this layer if they've already gone to it. So we're going to add a condition, that if statement. So if they've already visited this, don't show it. So we're going to come to show conditions, and we're going to add a condition here by clicking on the plus icon and say, okay, if the question 1 answered is equal to false, then go to question 1. That means that they haven't answered it yet. But as soon as they go to it, and then this changes to true, now if I come back to this question, so let me preview this again. If now that it's changed to true, but now if I come back to it, I won't be able to select on it. I'm trying to select it, it's not selecting because the variable has been changed to true and it's no longer false anymore, basically. So you have to change the variable, and then you have to add the condition to go to that if it's true or if it's false. Okay, so let me see if there's any questions right now. A question from a newbie: does this order of the triggers matter? Does the top trigger happen before the second trigger, and so on? Or do they all happen at once? Great question, and I hopefully answer that with this. It does matter, actually. The top one will trigger first, and so if I select the briefcase, this is the very first trigger to happen. This is the second trigger to happen. And so the first trigger is to show the layer if it's false. Now, then I change this to true. So basically, from there on, because it's true, unless I change it back to false for some reason, from there on, I won't be able to select on option 1. Could those question layers be pulling questions from a question library? So each time the user plays the game, there are different questions. You know what? I haven't found a way to be able to do that. You could establish your questions within variables. Like I can come into here, and let's say I want to add 1,000 points to be that variable. So instead of changing it in many different locations, I can establish this as a number. I can come into my variables, and I can establish, okay, this to be, or let's say if this is text. Actually, no, let's do a different thing. So let's say we have this label here, chosen case. I want to establish that as text. So I can come into the variable, add a variable, and then we're just going to name it chosen case, which the learner doesn't see the name of the variable, so you don't have to keep that in mind. And then the text, I'm going to just type in chosen case, click OK. And now let me copy the name of the variable. I can come back into storyline, and inside of any text field, I can basically show where I want this variable showing. So all I have to do is add a % sign in front of this, and then paste that variable name and add a % sign at the end of it. Now what will happen is if I preview this slide now, let me do something that, sorry, it's just the sound is playing when I'm talking here, so it's a little bit distracting, so I'm going to remove that sound. And now if I come back into here, go to play, start game, you'll notice that the chosen case text is now down there, so the learner doesn't know it's a variable. And now if I'm using that same label or same question throughout the different things, I can come back into my triggers, my variables, and I can change the default value to be something else. And now if I preview it, you see that that text is automatically changed. You can do something else as well. You can have the learner input their name. If you wanted to go to, let's say in the instructions, let's go insert, and we're going to insert, I forgot where, data entry right here. So if you go to data entry, text entry, we're going to insert a box. Now, basically, I'm not going to stylize that any more, but the learner will be able to type something in there. And then the trigger automatically on this text entry is it's going to set a text entry value to whatever they type in there. So if I'm going to come in and I'm going to establish a variable, I'm going to establish this variable as the name. So I'm going to say name, and then I'm going to leave it blank, because if they don't write anything in there, I don't want to use anything by default, so I'm just going to leave that blank. And so wherever I use name here, if I come back in and click OK, and so we're going to come back into this text entry, and we're going to say, okay, text entry, when somebody types this in there, we're going to set variable name to whatever that value is. And so we're going to change that value, and now I can come back into like the game board, for example, and let's just use this, change this variable, for example. Okay, so I'm going to change that now to name. I have my percent signs at the very beginning and end, and now if I preview this, this session is being recorded, so if you feel overwhelmed, you can go back and you can review it. So you can slow it down, pause it, and do whatever you want with it afterwards. So, okay, so type in your entry here. I'm going to go ahead and type in Jeff, and now I'm going to hit Start Game, and you'll notice down at the bottom, there's my name. So now you can use the learner's name or whatever entry value that you want throughout the game with using that variable, basically. So those are just some triggers that you can use inside of there. So now here's another thing. If the question 1 is selected, I have these 4 different choices. Now I want to take them to correct or incorrect depending on their choice. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to establish just some simple triggers. So this one is not correct. I'm going to establish a trigger to show the layer of question 1 incorrect. And I'm going to establish the trigger of question 1 correct if they select this option. And let's just do the first 2 for now, for time's sake. Now on question correct and incorrect, you'll notice something a little bit different. You'll notice I don't have my question over here. I don't have the logo right here. And all I have is a continue button. Well, what happens is you can actually, on a variable, well, if I preview this, let's go ahead and show you what happens when you preview it, and I'll show you how this is done. Okay, so I'm going to go to question 1, and then if I select correct, you'll notice that the correct answer pops up over, but the question 1 text still stays there. So they can see question 1 and they can see the correct feedback. But you don't have to type in question 1 in 2 different layers. The way that you do that is you select a layer, and by selecting the gear icon on the right hand side, you can actually hide, well, by default is selected where it says hide other slide layers. If you uncheck that, that will actually, for the correct and incorrect layers, you don't want to do that for question 1 because then you'll see previous questions. But if you do that for question 1 correct and question 1 incorrect, it will actually still show question 1, and it will still show the logo or whatever you want. So you don't have to repeat the questions for every correct and incorrect feedback that you put inside of there. Okay, so now incorrect and correct, all I would have to do is on the continue button, just go on to question 2. And then at the end, come down to the conclusion. Now, one other variable that I want to show you is adding points to a score. So let's go ahead and establish a score. I'm going to just put a text box here, and I'm going to insert a variable called score. Now let me put this on the base layer so it just stays there always. Okay, so if I have it on the base layer, that's just going to be visible unless I hide it on other layers. Okay. So now I need to establish the variable inside of Storyline. So I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to name it score, and this is going to be the score, so it's going to be a number. I'm going to click OK. If I click OK there, that score will then, I need to update that score whenever I get something correct. So if I go ahead and I select this object and I add a new trigger, I can select the drop-down box to be adjust variable. And the adjust variable, I can add the score. And now, instead of just equals, changing it to something different, I can add a point to it. So I select the drop-down box of the operator and just say, okay, add. I want to add a value of 1. Or if it's like the game show, you're adding a value of 200 or 500 or whatever point value you want. But in this case, I'm just going to add a point value of 1, and I would do that for the correct answer. Well, if I preview this now, so you can see my default score is 0. Hit play, start game, go to question 1, and as soon as I select this, you'll notice that it automatically updates to 1. And that's how you change, you update your score. So if you get on all the correct answers, if you update the score, then it will update your points, and so you can then have a score throughout the game and make it more interactive and more fun for your learners to be able to do that. Now at the end, in the conclusion page, I would just want to show their score as well. So I'm just going to type in score here. And as soon as they come to the conclusion page, it's basically going to show their score at the end. So I know it's an hour. That's a lot to cover within an hour. I know I went pretty fast on some points, so I apologize for that. But again, I wanted to get as much content in as possible to help you at least start out with some of your games. Going in and updating a score, working with some variables, working with triggers, working with conditions, and stuff like that. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to eLearning Brothers. We're more than happy to do that. We do have a survey at the end of this that will pop open. So if you have any questions about anything that you've seen, feel free to type that in. Leave us feedback so we can improve our webinars in the future. So make sure that you take time to do that. But that's all that I have. So thank you everyone for taking this hour before Labor Day weekend. So I hope you have a great weekend, and thank you. Have a good day.